Our protagonist was living a life of legend, with memories so vivid they felt like they happened only yesterday. In fact, a similar scene was unfolding right now. As a monster attacked, he smirked and taunted its frantic movements. He mocked it, asking why it was squirming like an eel in a hot pan, a question that would soon prove to be a grave miscalculation. His judgment was fatally flawed. The serpent, like beasts, struck true, a painful reminder that carelessness had always been his downfall. Staring into the monster's furious eyes, he casually remarked that he was only looking for a bit of fun to cure his boredom. The beast glared daggers at him, but in that life-or-death moment, he noticed an even more pressing issue. His armor was disintegrating. He calmly told himself it was fine, as this sort of thing was to be expected. With a surge of fury, he launched himself into the fray. After all, his short temper was another one of his famous traits. Leaping forward, he began unleashing a barrage of powerful, precise strikes. Truth be told, he absolutely reveled in the surge of power coursing through him. He adored the thrill of swinging his sword and slinging spells with abandon. The one thing he detested, however, was the unexpected. He tripped, a clumsy misstep he couldn't explain, and in that single, baffling moment, his life ended. The first sound to pierce the darkness of his next awakening was the soft echo of a woman's footsteps. His vision was a complete blur, making him question if this was all just a dream. As a figure approached, he saw a woman and was left wondering just where she could have possibly appeared from. Did he have an admirer tracking his every reincarnation? Ironically, all he truly wanted was to go back to sleep. The last battle had clearly taken its toll on him. The mysterious woman approached his bedside, her touch gentle as she reached for him. She leaned in close, placing a soft kiss on his forehead, and a delicate, floral scent filled the air, as light as her touch. A morning kiss from such a beautiful woman was simply divine. A thought crossed his mind. Had she been watching over him this entire time, admiring him and him alone? He found he couldn't resist the impulse any longer. He needed something more. He sat up, intending to return the kiss, but the reality of his situation crashed down on him. He wasn't in his own body. He was trapped in the tiny, helpless form. The shocking truth that he had been reborn was too much to bear. Unable to process it, he did the only thing his new body could. He began to the woman beside him cooed his new name, Arl, assuming he was merely hungry. But his tears weren't from hunger at all. They were from the crushing realization that he was reborn yet again. He must have truly died in that last fight, but the exact moment remained a blur. He couldn't pinpoint how it happened. As his new mother gently placed him in a crib, his mind raced with the unbelievable truth of his existence. Unlike anyone else, death for him was not an end but a revolving door that kept spinning. If his memory served, this was his 100th rebirth. He could still recall his very first life, a mundane existence back in Korea. That life had been a living hell of endless interviews, job hunting, and a soul-crushing routine. That bleak life ultimately met an equally unremarkable end when it was suddenly cut short. It was a tragic, abrupt end that led to his first reincarnation. He had woken up, utterly bewildered, to find himself in the body of an infant, surrounded by a family of complete strangers in a foreign land. Since that day, he has been reborn over and over again. His journey had taken him across countless worlds and through different eras, yet the script of his life never seemed to change. It was the same story, time after time. He wasn't proud of it. He had simply grown accustomed to his fate and learned to go with the flow. Thus, the cycle of reincarnation had become almost mundane to him. But this time, as he lay there, he couldn't help but wonder where on earth he had ended up now, been tossed into this time. Surveying his surroundings, the medieval-style interior suggested he'd landed in the distant past, but returning to Earth seemed illogical for this kind of reincarnation, so he was likely in another world entirely. And he much preferred other worlds anyway. They often boasted superior comfort, thanks to advanced technology and services, and this time, it seemed his luck had truly turned. He was clearly reborn into wealth, possibly even into a noble, aristocratic family. The presence of maids was a dead giveaway. He was definitely of noble birth. That alone was a massive upgrade, and his new mother seemed genuinely affectionate. She murmured to him, asking if he had eaten, though he couldn't yet understand her words. Of course, this world had its own distinct language. It was a familiar hurdle. At the start of a new life, he was always lost in translation for a while. Yet, his new mother's gentle touch and loving gaze communicated everything he needed to know. Her affection for him was undeniable and obvious. Across his countless rebirths, our hero had known hundreds of mothers, and he could say with certainty that many only bore children out of a cold sense of duty. As harsh as it sounds, there were lifetimes where he was abandoned immediately after birth or forced to work to repay the debt of being born. This life, however, felt different. He had a good feeling. As he contemplated his fortune, someone approached his mother, addressing her as Miss Liana. It was a maid, offering that if the mistress was tired, she could leave the prince in her care. That single word sent a shock through the protagonist. It turns out he was a prince. What was even stranger was the sudden, drastic shift in his mother's expression. She immediately demanded to know if everyone else truly recognized her child as a prince. The maid replied without a second's thought. Naturally, he will be recognized. But his mother wasn't convinced, telling the maid not to feign politeness since they were alone. She assumed the maid probably looked down on him as well. The maid, however, quickly objected, insisting that wasn't the case at all. The mistress then apologized, explaining that another maid had recently been quite insolent. It was in that moment that the hero finally understood the reason for his mother's sudden change in demeanor. She continued, saying, "Even though my son is a prince with imperial blood, his path will be anything but easy. it would have been simpler if Aurella hadn't been born a prince at all. She confessed that her only hope was that her baby wouldn't grow to resent her for it. The woman knew that she and her child were the subject of endless gossip. Because of her status, her son had no right to inherit the throne, all because she was just a common servant. Overcome with guilt, she apologized to her infant son. Then he reached out his tiny hand toward her, intending to wipe away her tears. Liana gasped with excitement, asking the maid, Fina, if she saw. It was as if the baby understood her completely. He genuinely didn't want his new mother to be sad. After all, he was perfectly fine. He didn't care that he wouldn't inherit the throne. For him, the life of a prince was already a winning lottery ticket. He could simply ignore the bothersome nobility. Not even the imperial family could truly control him, and this prince's life promised to be wonderfully unrestricted. Our protagonist celebrated internally. His 101st life was shaping up to be an absolute dream. He had been reborn as the son of the emperor and a former maid, a royal half-breed. It was the perfect setup for a comfortable life, so long as he steered clear of court politics. With the emperor's blood in his veins, he was guaranteed, at the very least, a life of considerable comfort, circumstances, or so he desperately hoped. A wave of pure joy washed over him, and he let out a laugh that drew everyone's attention. His mother, Lefanu, seeing her infant son so blissfully unaware, yet her heart ached with the wish that she possessed the strength to protect him from the world's harsh realities. Errol knew she was right. In this world, strength was the ultimate shield, an absolute necessity for anyone born into the viper's nest of nobility. Every noble had to be able to defend their position. So, it was time to learn all over again, a process he was all too familiar with. Lacking a claim to the throne was a critical weakness, and the world had no use for a weak man. If you were powerless, no one would ever come to your aid. In fact, they'd be the first to push you off the cliff. They would simply seek a convenient way to dispose of you. But his new mother had nothing to fear. After all, her son was a warrior who had been reborn with the memories of countless. 3 months had drifted by since he'd arrived in this new world. He spent that time in the deceptive tranquility of an infant's slumber, savoring this second chance at life. His mother was always by his side. Gazing down at him, she'd smile and whisper that he looked just like an angel in his sleep. She was particularly fond of his unusual and beautiful hair color. Presently, a maid entered to inform her mistress that the carriage was prepared. Liana replied that she would be out shortly. Before departing, she leaned down, kissed his forehead, and promised she'd return before he even had a chance to miss her. True to her word, she left for the carriage. Finally alone, our hero found himself wondering what sort of pleasant dream he'd just been having. As he mulled it over, an involuntary gurgle escaped his lips. The sound instantly put him on high alert, praying the nanny wasn't about to rush in. He couldn't get a single moment of peace. Being a baby meant he was under constant surveillance, with everyone watching his every move. This suffocating level of care was utterly exhausting. Now that he was finally alone, it was time to investigate something crucial. His entire future depended on it. He could only hope that this reincarnation into the imperial family blessed him with some form of ancestral power. If it did, he had to learn to wield it. Recalling the brutal lessons of his past lives, he knew he had to concentrate. He understood perfectly that in this world, only the strongest held the right to. If you possessed overwhelming power, no one would ever dare to challenge you. Thankfully, he could draw upon the vast experience of the 100 lives he lived before being reborn. Even within this tiny infant's body, he could begin to cultivate his inner energy, and just as he suspected, the power was indeed accessible here. With that confirmed, he could immediately attempt to practice the Hongan Shan techniques he mastered back in his 30th life. Furthermore, it was worth the risk to cultivate Xian Changji and Hongji simultaneously, despite the limitations of his current childlike form. He was confident these ancient arts would serve him well. After all, who would ever suspect an infant of secretly practicing profound technique? If his plan succeeded, by the time he reached the age of 10, his internal power would have grown exponentially. And by 20, he would be virtually invincible. But for now, he had to focus every ounce of his will on gathering his own internal energy. This method would allow Aurella to train anywhere, even while cradled in his nanny's arms. He could already feel the nascent flow of power coursing through his body. He decided to accelerate the process to gather and unify this scattered stream of energy. He could already feel the power beginning to pool in his hands. But the strain was too much for his infant brain. His head began to throb violently. He had no choice but to release all the accumulated energy at once. Alerted by a strange, muffled pop, the maid, Fina, rushed back into the room, her heart pounding with worry for the young prince. However, she found him lying peacefully in his crib, which eased her fears. Aurel, on the other hand, was completely drained and knew he needed to rest. Seeing nothing out of the ordinary, Fina concluded that perhaps his diaper was simply soiled. At that moment, Aurel had only one desperate wish, that she would leave immediately and not touch him. Even the slightest contact could cause the volatile energy he was barely containing to simply dissipate. He was mentally pleading with her to just go away. Thankfully, the maid merely sniffed to see if his diapers were all. It turned out they were clean, so she concluded the little prince must have been having a nightmare and finally left him in peace once more. This was the exact moment Aurel had been anticipating. His energy had peaked, and now all he needed to do was maintain that. And just like that, a problem arose if fever began to set in. The hero could only pray that this fragile infant body, his vessel in this reincarnation, could handle the strain. He hoped it could withstand the immense power, grimly thinking that perhaps death was preferable to being trapped in the helpless body of an infant. He had to accumulate more energy, and quickly, to overcome this perilous condition. Arl knew he had to get a grip on himself. After all, his future well-being depended on it. Abruptly, another strange noise echoed from the young prince's chambers. The maid rushed back to his side, and what she saw was truly startling. The young master was drenched in sweat, but the reason was a mystery. He had just been sleeping, after all. I should probably prepare a herbal bath for him, she decided. Once she departed the room again, the hero dropped his act, relieved that his silent efforts had worked. Shortly after, he was being changed into a fresh set of clothes. The comfort cheered him up immensely, and he let out a joyful laugh, sounding exactly like a real baby. The maid remarked that he was feeling wonderful, which meant he was doing just fine. It was a heartwarming sight, seeing the little boy give her such a carefree smile. Arl silently praised the heavens that the maid hadn't suspected a thing. Thanks to the mana concentration technique he knew before he was reborn, he could effortlessly gather mana within his body without lifting a finger. He was literally growing stronger just by eating and sleeping. At this realization, he could hardly contain his grin. It felt like his face might split from sheer joy. In just 3 years, he would amass enough energy to rival the strength of most grown men. And by the time he turned 10, no one in this world would be capable of harming him, even if he were to live another 100 lifetimes. Just then, the maid heard a peculiar noise and wondered what it might be. But the baby just cooed again, and she was once more captivated by his adorable smile. The boy, however, was solely focused on his goal of getting stronger to finally enjoy a lavish royal life. He simply couldn't wait for that glorious moment to arrive. I can't wait for that day, he thought. And just like that, a full 5 months had passed since his birth. Utilizing the mana absorption technique, his physical abilities had already increased dramatically. His internal energy was accumulating far faster than any of his peers, and mana was being gathered automatically. It didn't matter that he was just crawling on the floor for now. In due time, his power would be unleashed to its absolute fullest potential. As he was lost in these ambitious thoughts, he suddenly felt himself being lifted. It turned out to be his mother. She had noticed how lively her baby was becoming, and wanted to show him something she had brought. In her hands, she held a cute little toy. The hero was completely baffled. He didn't understand why, but he found himself utterly captivated, unable to even tear his gaze away. Gazing at his mother, he was horrified by the thought that she might be disappointed, so he let out a sweet gurgle, which immediately delighted her. She assumed he liked the toy. Meanwhile, by virtue of his reborn consciousness, he was cringing with secondhand embarrassment. The maid then chimed in, saying the young prince looked incredibly happy. She remarked that he must really like the toy and that his mommy would play with him often, calling him a cutie. And it's a wonder who he takes after to be so handsome. The boy was taken aback by this question, thinking to himself, it's obviously my mother, of course. He then resolved that since he was so adored, he might as well become a charming, flirtatious child. Overindulge in it, as it was far too fleeting and precious. Suddenly, a wave of hunger washed over him, his expression shifting so noticeably that they asked if he was tired of playing. The boy began to cry, utterly frustrated that they'd gotten it all wrong. He inwardly cursed the limitations of this tiny body. The nanny, however, saved the day, astutely declaring that the young prince must. And as soon as he was fed, he overheard his mother and the maid discussing their financial troubles. Fina insisted that the prince needed to be properly nourished, but since yesterday, their allocated funds had dwindled even further. His mother noted sadly that she was aware, but feared there was nothing she could do. The maid agreed, explaining that with the mansion's maintenance budget having been drastically cut this year, it was becoming nearly impossible to raise even one child. Errol started to realize that he'd overheard a similar conversation between the maids not too long ago. They were talking about having to cut corners. They even mentioned skimping on Lady Lana's meals. Otherwise, they might not all make it through the season. It was a dreadful thought, but they had no other choice. Our hero then understood the gravity of the situation. They were completely serious. His mother had assured him they wouldn't starve, and that was a small comfort, believing they could somehow manage the rest. When the maid suggested cutting costs on security, the full truth of his reborn life dawned on our hero. His mother was nothing more than a simple concubine. She held no real power or status, despite having given birth to a prince. The maid, Fina, went on to explain that the approaching winter was making their already dire situation even worse. She elaborated that the harshness of winter was a major aggravating factor, and while she didn't want to cause alarm, at this point, even relying on the farms was out of the question. Errol was stunned that things were this bad. He had naively hoped that his royal status as a prince would at least prevent him from perishing as an infant. Soon after, the maid cautiously brought up an idea. What if we were to ask His Majesty for help? But his mother pointed out how difficult it was to see the king, who had been exceptionally busy lately. Our hero finally understood where his mother kept disappearing to. It seemed she could never even manage to get an audience. As ruthless a ruler as he was, it was utterly unacceptable for his own father to treat the mother of his child with such cold indifference. He couldn't understand why the king would do this to such a gentle woman who had already endured so much scorn from other nobles. The boy was now faced with a critical question. What could he possibly do? Even if the king was indifferent, this neglect was unforgivable. He felt an overwhelming sorrow for his mother, and he began to cry. The maid, misinterpreting his tears, thought he wanted his mother and handed him over. But at that moment, Errol truly only wanted one thing: to help her. Even in a child's body, surely there was something his adult mind could conjure up. That being said, nothing immediately came to mind. But with the knowledge from his previous life, he was determined to find a way. Night fell, and our protagonist lay pondering the core issue. All he needed to do was survive the coming winter. The problem boiled down to a simple lack of money for their basic needs. And with winter, a new, major expense would heating. He needed to think seriously about how he could possibly help. Then, a fascinating thought sparked in his mind. It was a flash of genius, a memory from his life before reincarnation. What if I tried this, he thought. If one considered it logically, coal is a carbon structure, and so, fundamentally, it's just like the structure of a diamond. The boy then noticed the gemstones his mother was wearing, which could only mean that in this new world, they were valued as well. In that case, the solution was surprisingly simple. If he couldn't get his hands on money, then at least he would try to create precious stones. Fueled by this new purpose, he attempted to scale the barriers of his crib, only to fail hilariously. He only stumbled because his infant legs were too short. If that initial plan had failed, he would have needed a back. Considering the vast amount of mana he possessed, the solution didn't take long to formulate. He would simply use his flight skill. Now he was certain he could fly directly to his objective. Besides, no one was going to notice a little missing especially since there was so much of it. With a simple gesture, he would transmute this worthless pile of coal into a priceless diamond. This was no time for childish games. Focus was paramount. He had to create the gem while the rest of the palace was deep in slumber. Recalling the precise methodology from his past, he initiated the complex process. First, he needed to convert his mana into raw thermal energy. Then, he had to locally generate the immense pressure and temperature necessary to trigger the coal's transformation. In this endeavor, he couldn't afford to be conservative with his mana. He could always accumulate more later, assuming he survived. At the same time, he had to prevent any energy from leaking out. It was an incredibly difficult task in an infant's body, a constant struggle for someone reborn into this frail form. He compressed the energy harder and harder. Aurel realized he had to unleash even more of his internal power and hold on until the very end. He was just moments away from achieving his goal. If this succeeded, his mother would be happy. All he wanted was for his mommy to keep smiling and to truly enjoy her life. So, for his mother's sake, he pushed himself to the limit, conjuring a thick cloud of smoke with his power. He directed the smoke up the chimney and flew out under its cover. Once the process was finished, the young boy rolled effortlessly over the fireplace. When he collected himself, he saw the brilliant diamond in his tiny hands and realized his desperate, high-stakes plan had actually worked. The stone he held was exquisitely beautiful and shimmering with an inner light. It was, without a doubt, a perfect diamond. All that remained was to somehow get it to his mother. Compared to what he just accomplished, that part would be simple, and he savored the feeling of Morning arrived. The maid assigned to the young prince entered with a cheerful greeting, but she stopped dead in her tracks, utterly stunned by the scene. He was sitting on the floor, wailing and covered in soot. She gasped, asking how on earth he managed to get out of his crib. After all, the walls were far too high for a baby to climb. She prayed the poor child hadn't been lying on the cold floor the entire night. On top of that, he was absolutely filthy. She couldn't imagine where he got so dirty. Perhaps it was from the embers left in the fireplace. Even his blanket was on the floor, which meant his highness had been on quite an adventure all night. Strangely, the entire floor was also covered in a fine layer of soot. The maid wondered if the palace cleaners had simply neglected their duties. She was just thankful the baby hadn't frozen from the cold. Aurel, however, merely wished she wouldn't worry, knowing his enhanced body was perfectly fine. In his mind, everything had gone according to plan. It was then that Chaina noticed the young prince was concealing something in his mouth. Fearing he might swallow it, she urged him to spit it out at once and gently touched his cheek to coax his mouth open. With no other option, the boy spat the diamond out. The nanny caught it in her hand, and her eyes widened with limitless surprise. She stammered, asking where the prince could possibly have found it. It wasn't as if priceless jewels were just left lying around. It was truly unbelievable. She cleaned this room meticulously every single day, so there was no chance she could have missed a diamond of that size, which was clearly worth a fortune. This single gem could be the very thing to pull them out of their dire situation. Their prince was a genius for finding it. The reborn boy, at that moment, only had a single thought. He hoped his mother would like it. As much as his nanny did following the incident, throngs of people streamed into the palace, which was now overflowing with supplies. At long last, the people had enough firewood to endure the winter, and the once bare kitchen pantry was swiftly stocked with all manner of provisions. Ultimately, the small treasure the boy had manifested was sold to the highest bidder, and the proceeds from its sale were enough to cover a full 5 years of living expenses. Reflecting on this, Liana couldn't help but wonder if they had acted correctly, questioning if the diamond had belonged to someone else, but the maid quickly reassured her that it was impossible. After all, this castle had stood for nearly 100 years before her arrival. She believed it was simply a divine gift sent from the heavens for their prince, a blessing for his reborn life. The mistress conceded that perhaps it was true, feeling immensely relieved. The hero, for his part, was thinking only of her, eagerly awaiting the day he grew up so he could finally ease all her burdens. As for his majesty, his part-time father, the boy resolved to find out more about Aurella. He would personally force him to see the truth. Throughout the long winter, the palace remained warm, heated by a roaring fireplace. The financial state of the palace had also improved dramatically. Liana was now served bountiful meals, though she couldn't comprehend why she was given so much food, as it was far more than she could possibly eat alone. The maid simply encouraged her not to worry and to eat to her heart's content. One of the previously dismissed maids returned to her post, overjoyed, and the head maid told her to thank the young prince. It seemed the rumors were true, those who had been let go were being rehired, but the greatest joy for our protagonist was seeing that his mother was no longer sad. After all, she was so incredibly beautiful when she smiled. The winter itself had been brutally cold, but they had spent it in warmth and comfort, all thanks to their newfound wealth. An entire year had passed since then. The mistress, along with her, was selecting an outfit for the baby. The nanny inquired which one she would choose, and the lady commented that they were both excellent, at which point she simply presented a third alternative. The boy started to change into an identical outfit, but in reverse. He was not pleased in the slightest, wondering why this whole dress-up ordeal was so tedious. He thought, I wonder if there's some kind of special celebration happening for them to be making such a fuss. By this point, he was already completely overwhelmed. The prince was briefly left to his own devices. He promptly flopped over and began to wail, making the women realize he was utterly spent, and they gently placed him in his crib. The maid then mentioned that today they would finally formally introduce the prince to the imperial family. This news took the boy by surprise, even in his reincarnated mind. His mother remarked that it was true, expressing how glad she was that they had all made it through the year safely. My son must be officially recognized, she declared. He may still be a baby, but he has imperial blood flowing through his veins, and his first birthday is the perfect occasion for it. The maid noted, I am certain His Majesty will make an appearance. He cannot ignore you forever. It's just that custom dictates they keep their distance from newborn babies. While they were discussing the matter, Errol realized his first birthday in this new life was approaching. Leona stated that it was imperative to prepare the most lavish banquet imaginable. My son will officially become a part of the royal family, she said. I am so grateful to God that the laws of the empire are, at the very least, on my son's side. He understood his mother's profound anxiety but could only offer a baby's smile at the same time. And if it's a banquet, he mused, that means all sorts of aristocrats will be in attendance. Still, I'd really like to finally meet my father. And in no time at all, the lavish event was in full swing, the hall buzzing with cheerful guests and tables overflowing with food. Errol appreciated the lively atmosphere, yet he couldn't help but wonder about the astronomical sum of money spent on all this. Moreover, everyone around him was dressed in such opulent attire. Wasn't this a bit much for a banquet? His mother then lifted him into her arms, asking if he was enjoying him. It wasn't that he liked it, he mused, but it was certainly a pleasant spectacle to observe. A nearby maid then commented that he was likely just a little overwhelmed by all the new faces. The young prince, after all, had never been around so many people at once. Madame agreed, reassuring him that there was no need to be afraid. After all, he was the most important person here today. It was at that moment the boy noticed something unsettling. It was the piercing stares from the crowd, accompanied by their hushed whispers. He quickly realized the aristocrats were already beginning to scrutinize him, but honestly, who cared what they thought? The best course of action was simply to ignore them completely. Besides, what truly vexed him was the whereabouts of the blasted emperor. Eresia, the man who was supposedly his. The boy desperately wanted to see the shameless face of the man who hadn't shown himself even once after fathering a child, but then again, what did he truly care about that man's life? He just needed to know what he looked like, in case he'd been cursed with bad genetics in this new life, having been reborn. Quite soon after the banquet commenced, the very people he was thinking of made their grand entrance, the imperial family themselves. As he watched them, the little prince marveled at the sight, the reigning empress and her children. That woman, he thought, looked every bit the part of an empress, and the children were her spitting image. They must be his half-brothers and sisters. It appeared the young man at the front was the eldest of the group. He certainly stood out, and those trailing him were his younger siblings. It was almost comical how even the redhead seemed shy. That being said, it was unclear why they all wore such grim expressions. Errol was rather irritated by this, especially as they walked right past his mother, as if she were invisible. Hearing the boy's discontented sigh, his mother asked what was wrong, telling him to be patient just a little while longer because it would all be over soon. The hero felt a surge of happiness seeing that, despite the slight, his mother was still smiling. Then he overheard people murmuring that with the empress's arrival, the banquet had truly come alive, for she was exceptionally beautiful. Errol kept his eyes fixed on his mom, but suddenly noticed something strange. Her gaze had become incredibly focused, and she seemed utterly bewildered. He naturally wondered what had captured her attention. To find out, he followed her line of sight, turning his head in the same direction, just as another man strode into the hall, prompting cries for everyone to greet His Majesty. It turned out to be the emperor himself, and by extension, the boy's long-absent father. Upon seeing him, our hero was completely stunned, wondering what kind of overwhelming energy was radiating from him. As it happened, the moment this man passed, the chattering nobles and their attendants fell into an immediate, reverent silence. One by one, everyone in the hall bowed their heads to this man. On a purely instinctual level, could feel the immense power emanating from him. And then, his father's gaze shifted in their direction. The boy's mind raced, questioning whether the man was looking at him or if his attention was solely on his mother. It was a shame he wasn't reborn with the ability to read minds. It would be incredibly useful to know what these people were truly thinking. After a short while, the nobles began to present the boy with gifts. A growing line of aristocrats approached, all proclaiming what an honor it was to finally see him. When it came time for the imperial family to offer their congratulations, however, the atmosphere grew tense. One of the women remarked that Prince Errol was so small, and it was clear they considered her a miserable sight, and they weren't shy about openly expressing their disdain for the hero and his mother. Our hero, with the mind of an adult, was utterly baffled. He simply couldn't comprehend the sheer audacity of these people. To say such things, as if he and his mother weren't even human beings. The prince, it seemed, was just as rotten as his followers. Perhaps a high-pitched infantile shriek was needed to test their hearing. Just then, his mother tried to calm him, asking if he wanted some milk. He quickly realized that a tantrum would only embarrass his mother, so he decided to play the part of a good boy. After all, he was reborn to protect her, this time. Hypocrisy was the official language in this palace. He desperately wanted to escape this farce before he inevitably fell asleep right in his mother's arms. Suddenly, he felt a sharp tug on his cheek. The pinch was surprisingly painful, and he couldn't see who the culprit was. It turned out to be a young girl from an aristocratic family, who cooed about how chubby he was. Errol immediately guessed she must be the daughter of one of the emperor's concubines, a child still too young to understand her own precarious status in the court. Soon after, the concubines themselves approached, offering polite, yet hollow, birthday wishes to the prince. The boy simply thanked them for the congratulations, told them to enjoy the banquet, and watched as they turned their backs, and walked away without another word. It wasn't long before the agonizing banquet finally concluded, and as it did, the boy and his mother were carried away, with Errol letting out an internal sigh of relief. But their escape was cut short when the empress herself approached, greeting Lana. The boy's mother returned the greeting, and the empress asked if she'd had a pleasant journey. Lana noted that everything was fine, with no problems to speak of, attributing the smooth trip entirely to her son, the heir to the throne, who was with her the whole time. Errol knew she was just shamelessly bragging, but what else could one expect from the empress? Her Majesty then turned her attention to the baby, remarking that the boy looked a great deal like Lana. She called him nice enough, but our hero refused to accept this fake kindness, certain that she had a direct hand in their miserable plight. He knew that even with widespread neglect, their castle's financing wouldn't have been slashed so drastically without her influence. They were forced to use nights to gather firewood, and his own baby clothes were sewn servants from nothing more than rags and scraps. The empress then wished the young prince a long life, a sentiment for which Lana, of course, dutifully thanked her. But the empress simply continued to stare with that superficial smile, until the emperor himself finally arrived to offer his congratulations. He asked Lana if she was well and if she had grown accustomed to the castle. The woman replied that everything was perfectly fine. She thanked His Majesty for his concern. Hearing this, our hero was internally screaming, knowing they were on the verge of death by poverty. He wanted his so-called father to just give them money for living expenses, a truly frustrating fate after his reincarnation. At that moment, he started making strange, agitated noises, which piqued the emperor's curiosity. The ruler then asked Lana to hand him the boy, for he wanted to get a better look. Once in his arms, the emperor was surprised the baby wasn't crying, noting that his other children always roared non-stop when they saw his face. Despite the man, Errol flashed a calculated, dazzling smile, hoping to completely disarm him with its charm. Seeing his expression, the emperor remarked that this boy was amusing. Our hero, however, wasn't afraid of him in the slightest. He was about to do something that would make the man's jaw hit the floor. With that in mind, he began to squirm and twist purposefully. His father wondered aloud what was wrong, asking if he should let him go, and promptly did so, setting the boy down on the ground. Lana instantly realized this was a terrible mistake and cried out that Errol was not yet able to walk, a fact that didn't surprise the emperor in the slightest, as the boy was merely 1 year old. Regardless, those present froze in anticipation of what would happen next. Then, to everyone's astonishment, the baby pushed himself up and slowly began to take his first. He wanted all eyes fixed on him. After all, this reborn life was his stage, and he was the star of the evening. A delighted Shayna rushed to tell Madame that the prince had just taken his very first step, a truly joyous moment. This development even took the emperor by surprise, proving this baby was full of surprises. Our hero pressed onward, thinking to himself that with just a little more effort, he could prove his reincarnation made him different. He was determined to show everyone that he was unlike any other child, and he would do it right here, in front of the entire court and the imperial family. Upon reaching the grand table, he tugged firmly on the tablecloth, which, as expected, began to slide down, taking all the fine dishes on top with it. When my mother saw the unfolding chaos, she was utterly aghast, a reaction mirrored by my father. But in reality, nothing truly terrible had occurred, because I had meticulously planned this entire spectacle. Just moments ago, everyone was captivated by the prince's first steps, so no one could possibly suspect a thing. It was a meticulously planned strategy, and I, Errol, had chosen the most opportune moment for this display, and now it was time for the next phase. I needed to feign distress, which was exactly the plan. And so, there I lay amidst the shattered porcelain, wailing with all my might. I knew I just had to cry louder for a more convincing performance. After all, I'm supposed to be a helpless child, right? The emperor, as expected, was completely startled by the commotion. He rushed to his son's side, anxiously asking if he was all right. After a quick examination, he announced that the baby was unharmed, having only doused himself with wine. Thankfully, he was all in one piece, but his clothes needed to be changed immediately. To that end, a maid requested His Majesty to hand over the boy, but the Emperor motioned for her to wait a moment. A clear look of displeasure crossed his face. Reaching down, he touched the baby's wine-soaked clothes and tore at the fabric, revealing what was underneath. He saw old, filthy rags, and demanded to know what this was. The maid could scarcely believe her own eyes, wondering how this could have possibly happened, as she had personally dressed him in fine new garments just that morning. It became painfully clear to all that the Emperor was not going to be pleased. Immediately, those present began to whisper amongst themselves, questioning what it was he was wearing. How shockingly modest for a prince, one whispered. Are they destitute? The Emperor heard every single one of these hushed remarks, which naturally enraged him. He roared for silence, and the aristocrats immediately fell quiet. An uncomfortable silence descended upon the hall. Turning to Lana, the Emperor demanded to know what kind of life the prince was living. At that moment, our hero rejoiced internally, seeing that his father had walked right into his trap. Earlier that morning, while his nanny was dressing him, the boy had waited for her to leave before. The moment she was gone, he focused his mana, a skill retained from his reincarnation, and began to stretch the fabric with all his might. The material gave way with ease, and, making it look worn and shabby, was no trouble at all. If he had possessed an adult's strength, it would have required even less mana. Most importantly, he had succeeded in exposing an inconvenient truth. Now, everyone would see the neglect hidden behind the glossy facade. The Emperor turned to the hero's mother, demanding she deign to explain how such a thing was possible. Is it truly so difficult to maintain your station? He questioned sharply. The woman could only mumble an incoherent reply, prompting him to inform her that she was clearly unfit for this duty. He decided to ask after all, and promptly turned to his servant, Jen, whose expression immediately grew wary as he inquired what was required of him. His Highness demanded to know precisely how much funding was allocated for the maintenance of the concubines' palaces and why such an egregious situation was occurring. In the middle of this crucial event, the servant explained that the Emperor himself had personally ordered the budget to be distributed equally. Therefore, everything had been executed according to his command. Thiel's voice sharpened. Define equally, before he roared for the... He demanded the financial records be brought to him at once. Errol was surprised by his father's sudden resolve, though he was secretly thrilled. He was more than happy to see the numbers finally exposed. Meanwhile, Lana apologized to His Majesty, insisting that the fault was entirely hers. The Emperor offered no verbal response, simply placing their son back into her arms. Our hero, having been reborn into this drama, knew his mother just needed to be patient. If she could just hold on a little longer, everything would work out. This was a pivotal opportunity for them. Unsurprisingly, the banquet and all its festivities ground to a halt as the assembled guests exchanged nervous glances, wondering what bombshell would drop next. At long last, Jen returned clutching the requested report, while the Empress stood frozen, a mask of feigned anticipation on her face. As the Emperor scanned the document, the truth of the situation dawned on him, and he furiously crumpled the report in his fist. He even unleashed his aura, incinerating the parchment as he roared in disbelief. Leanna couldn't help but feel a flicker of fear at the raw display of his power. Witnessing his father's volcanic rage, the protagonist confirmed his suspicions. The Emperor had been completely oblivious to the scheme. And in that moment, it became crystal clear who the true mastermind was. Terrell's gaze turned glacial as he faced the Empress. He demanded to know if she had any knowledge of this, questioning how such a discrepancy could even be possible. His wife, however, delayed her answer, playing the part of an innocent. She feigned complete ignorance, asking with practiced concern, "Is something amiss, Your Majesty?" The Emperor explained how a massive hole had appeared in the budget, leaving his concubines with practically zero funds. Still playing the victim, the Empress gasped that it was impossible. Thiel, however, wasn't buying her act for a second. He retorted that whether she was aware or not was irrelevant. It was her direct responsibility to oversee the budget's distribution. At that point, the eldest son and heir to the throne stepped forward to defend his mother. He addressed his father directly, insisting that it must be a simple misunderstanding, for his mother would never dare to commit such an act. But the Emperor cut him off, questioning what difference it made, as a manager is always responsible for their subordinates' failures. And because of her negligence, he boomed, "Your little brother has been left starving and cold." The Crown Prince then cast a regretful glance toward Errol. Our hero did not like that look one bit. He could see the wheels turning in his half-brother's mind, revealing a truly unpleasant character. The prince seemed to possess neither the Emperor's charisma nor the Empress's cunning. His Highness pressed his eldest son further. He asked if he was truly trying to claim his mother had no involvement, leaving the prince utterly speechless. Turning back to his wife, Thurl stated coldly that he was deeply disappointed in her, and the tension in the room became so thick you could cut it with a knife. Then unexpectedly, Leanna stepped forward to defend the Empress, pleading with the Emperor not to blame her and claiming the fault was all hers. She explained that she simply hadn't been aware that the funds were not arriving. The Emperor, taken aback, asked what kind of mistake she could possibly be referring to. She had carried and given birth to his child, which alone was enough to make them official members of the imperial family. In response, Leanna mumbled something incoherent. The Emperor gently took her hand, reminding her that she must become aware of her own status within the palace, even offering a faint, sweet smile as he said it, a clear sign of his favor. The Empress was clearly displeased, a fact unmasked by her sour expression. Shortly after, Emperor Terrell ordered that those responsible be found and brought to justice, declaring he would not tolerate such mistakes again. Aaliyah had no choice but to agree, so she declared that she would personally ensure this never happened again. The Emperor simply reiterated his warning that the next time she would be the one facing punishment. The Empress noted his threat, vowing to find the culprit and punish them severely. Inwardly, however, she couldn't understand why he was so furious with her. Putting on a mask of sorrow, she approached Lana, telling her she was truly sorry and didn't know how to possibly justify herself. Our protagonist, however, was well aware that this was a brazen lie. It was painfully obvious she was faking it. In response to the Empress's performance, the boy's mother said there was no need for an apology whatsoever. Errol despised her act. He recognized the woman as a venomous snake who must have known everything from the start. The next thing you know, Elia swore it wouldn't be repeated, but the boy remained utterly unconvinced of her innocence. He could see that all these women were simply intimidated by her overwhelming power. And just like that, the main character's birthday came to a close. The hole in the budget was patched, and a scapegoat was found with disturbing speed. It was a family of minor aristocrats, and they were expertly framed to look guilty. Naturally, without a proper trial, they were immediately executed. The maids discussed how, at the end of the so-called investigation, the family even pleaded guilty, though no one knew what they would have done with such a massive amount of money. At the same time, they were just glad the problem was finally resolved. Hearing this conversation from his room, our hero was certain the real culprit had escaped punishment. How cleverly the Empress had planned it all. Once the execution was carried out, the case was immediately closed, but the boy understood this grave injustice. It didn't matter, because when he grew up in this reborn life, he would obliterate them all. And then, his infant instincts took over, and he cried because he was hungry. Hearing his wail, the maid immediately jumped to it. Shayna fed the boy, cooing that he ate well and would grow up big and strong, while he internally grumbled that this whole process was a work in progress. He would be a baby for a long time to come, but at least his only jobs were eating and playing. Plus, sleeping after a meal was a definite perk. Some time passed. Errol awoke in his crib, wondering just how long he had slept. Nearby, he saw the maid, who was also sleeping peacefully in her chair. Something interesting was happening outside. He could see a carriage. It soon became clear that it was his mother's carriage, and she was accompanied by a group of knights. To get a better look out the window, our hero used his unique skill to float into the air. Soon, he heard footsteps approaching. It sounded like 4 people. But as he listened more closely, he realized that wasn't right. There were only 3 of them. One was his mom. He also heard the footsteps of another adult and 1 child. It was then he realized he'd forgotten about the babysitter. It would be disastrous if she woke up and saw his power. His entire reincarnation could be exposed. He had to get back to the crib before anything happened. As he was trying to do so, the door to the room swung open, and Liana entered with another woman and a child. His mom saw her son grabbing the babysitter's cheek and seemingly pulling on it. She immediately cried out, "Son, don't hurt the baby. She should be loved and obeyed, not treated like that." Shayna then awoke and saw the woman who had arrived with them, recognizing her instantly, was none other than Mrs. Fina. Liana apologized for not noticing her immediately and offered a warm greeting. The guest, however, was not offended, explaining that it was quite all right, as she hadn't sent any word of her visit. This was a woman the protagonist remembered all too well, a memory sharp and clear as if from a life reborn. She was another of her father's concubines, and her name, Liana recalled, was Fina. Liana mentioned that had she known in advance, she would have prepared a more fitting reception, but her guest insisted it was of no consequence, as she had deliberately kept her visit quiet. Next, asking her daughter to wait, Fina requested a private word with the lady of the house. Soon, the two were secluded in a room, with cups of tea set between them on the table. Liana couldn't help but wonder about the reason for this sudden visit, suspecting the conversation was about to become quite serious. Her guest interrupted these thoughts by addressing her directly, which caused the woman to choke on her tea in surprise. Liana then braced herself, wondering what Fina wanted to say. The girl began by stating that she wished to offer an apology, leaving Liana completely bewildered as to why. Fina then clarified that she was apologizing for her behavior during Prince Errol's birthday banquet. Confessing her embarrassment over the incident, she offered her sincere regrets. Liana was genuinely taken aback by this gesture, momentarily at a loss for words. She recognized her guest as Fina Kest, a name from the not-so-distant past. During the peak of the Continental War, Filia's family had made one of the greatest contributions to the victory. There wasn't a single soul in the Empire who hadn't heard of the Kest family, but their glory was now a thing of the past. No male heirs had been born into the family for some time, and their fame had rapidly diminished. Rumor had it that, after several difficult years, they were in severe financial trouble. Liana gently inquired if her visit was related to her family's situation, and her guest confirmed that it was true they were drowning in debt. The Empress, it turned out, had approached her with a proposition, and now Fina presented the pouch of gold coins she had received as part of it. Liana immediately insisted that she wanted nothing, but Fina pressed on, saying this was her own wish, even though she knew it was not nearly enough to solve the underlying problem. It was, however, a start. She expressed her profound regret for what had transpired and wanted Liana to understand. She pleaded that Liana could hate her, but begged her not to think poorly of her family. Immediately after, her gaze shifted towards the open doorway, where her young daughter stood, captivated by the books on a shelf. In that instant, Liana understood everything. Fina was simply trying to protect her child from the vicious conflicts of the imperial family. With this realization dawning on her, Liana assured her that it was all right. She truthfully had no need for the money, as she believed Fina's family was innocent in the matter. In response, her guest insisted there was no need for pity, to which Liana heard herself reply that no one was pitying her. Instead, Liana stated plainly that there was no reason for their families to be at odds. She understood the situation perfectly and didn't hold any grudge, suggesting it would be far better to spend that money on a gift for her young daughter, offering a chance to be reborn from past grievances. This also explained why Filia's palace had its funding cut so drastically. While she couldn't be certain, she thought that was the heart of the matter. Filia, knowing it all too well, confirmed that her suspicions were correct. It all stemmed from the fact that Liana had once been Her Majesty's personal maid. Errol was in disbelief, utterly astonished, but now he finally understood why the Empress disliked her so intensely. He felt genuinely sorry for her, as did his mother. He then grumbled for his maid to stop shaking him, prompting the maid to remark on his ever-changing moods. After ensuring the young prince was settled, Hyan made her way back to the princess. Kane inquired if she had traveled a great distance, while the hero knew that using that power would mean repeating the very same actions as before. He continued to listen in on their conversation, soon managing to make out their words. After all, his mother had said she could understand the woman. Because of this, she took that dismissive attitude for granted. However, since she couldn't escape the oppression, she was forced to make a difficult decision for my sake. She resolved that until Aurel was grown, she would protect him and never again allow that woman to harm her family. With that in mind, she proposed to Lady Filia that they should become friends, a suggestion that left the other woman completely astonished. Filia realized this was no longer a simple conspiracy, but the formation of an entire association of power against the concubines, a fact that didn't scare her in the least. And so, she quickly agreed, knowing that if she were ever backed into a corner, she would now have a helping hand waiting for her. Ael then understood that his mother knew everything. She was fully aware of the bitter conflict between the Empress and the concubines. Now, however, he could only wonder what her next move would be, and whether he needed to start preparing for the consequences in advance. Suddenly, he sensed someone's presence drawing near. It was Princess Kania, but the boy was not at all pleased by her appearance here. He saw the little girl offer a saccharine smile, and he forced himself to smile back, hoping that would be the end. He prayed she wouldn't start clinging to him, but she immediately began pulling on his cheek again, exclaiming how very soft and warm it was. Ael's only thought was that she must have nothing better to do, probably thinking of him as nothing more than her personal toy. Chaina saw what was happening between them and approached, asking what the princess was doing. For a moment, the hero believed she had come to see, but there was no such luck. She also began to laugh sweetly, remarking how incredibly cute they were, before asking the young princess if she would be visiting often. The little girl replied that if she was allowed to, she would be delighted. Those words were the final blow for our hero. He could only hope for someone, anyone, to come to his aid. Time passed quickly enough, and the young prince was soon 30 months old. He was already steady on his feet and realized his third birthday was just around the corner. Life, after all, was just as fleeting in this reborn existence. But then again, that was always the case. He found himself wishing he could grow up faster, knowing he still had to endure the long journey to adulthood. He longed to learn how to charm the ladies again, though he recalled from his past life that he could win over any girl in a mere 10 minutes. As he was lost in these thoughts, the sharp clatter of heels began to echo from down the hallway. Ael was instantly on guard, recognizing the all-too-familiar sound. It was Kane, who reported that the Empress had arrived. But once she stepped inside and looked around, she saw no one and decided to survey the room more carefully. Spotting his feet peeking out from behind the curtain, she feigned confusion, asking, "Isn't he here?" before suddenly leaping towards him, yelling that he was busted. She then asked if he wanted to play a round of hide and seek with his big sister. The boy, of course, wanted nothing of the sort, but his feelings on the matter were completely ignored. She started dragging him along, insisting they play, but said they needed to find somewhere more spacious. Soon they were outside together, and it was the boy's turn to be the seeker. Since Lady Filia's visit, the princess had been visiting them directly. Naturally, this development hadn't occurred without the help of his soulless babysitter, but it wasn't an entirely bad thing. It had, after all, led to a strong friendship developing between his mother and Lady Filia. Suddenly, the girl asked, "Isn't your little sister just the best?" She proclaimed that even though Ael was still small, she could take care of him. He just had to believe in her, and when he grew up, everything would be perfect to look after her, demanding he promised to come whenever she called. The young prince had no choice but to reluctantly agree. Despite his agreement, he couldn't fathom Kane's sheer obsessiveness. After all, the girl proclaimed she simply adored him far more than the others. Compared to Leonid or Meryl, she insisted he was much more fun to play with, making him the best option. Arl privately thought that once they grew up, she would surely regret those words. Kana, bursting with energy, suddenly grabbed the boy, announcing they were going off to play somewhere else. He let out a gasp from her surprisingly strong embrace, mentally screaming for a rescue, a plea the maid seemed to witness. She gently told the princess that the prince was uncomfortable being carried like that and asked her to hand him over, reminding her that she shouldn't be carrying heavy things. After all, she was still just a little girl herself. Our hero rejoiced internally, convinced that Kana's maid was a literal angel sent to save him. Kana, however, grew capricious, whining that she still wanted to play. The maid tactfully suggested, "How about we do some drawing or perhaps listen to some classical music?" Turning up her nose, the princess declared that was incredibly boring, so the maid patiently asked what she would prefer to do. The little girl didn't actually know what she wanted, so she began to chaotically search for any form of entertainment. Her eyes landed on a nearby stick, which she immediately snatched up, proclaiming that she wanted to swing a sword just like she'd seen her brother Kyle do. Observing her, Arl noted how her center of gravity was completely off. She had no balance, even with the negligible weight of the wooden stick. He himself had a deep love for fencing, a passion he'd carried over since being reborn, and he found himself missing the familiar feeling of a blade in his hand. The princess, meanwhile, continued her dramatic play acting of being defeated in a grand battle. The maid gently pointed out that proper ladies do not engage in fighting. Kana couldn't understand why it was perfectly fine for her brothers, Kyle and Leonid. Her maid simply argued that it wasn't proper for her to get her hands dirty. She was told not to argue, as that was simply the accepted way. Above all, a princess was expected to be elegant and feminine. But while the maid was lecturing, her makeshift sword was suddenly snatched away by Aurella, who ordered the princess to hand over the weapon. He then declared he wouldn't take it, but would instead teach her fencing. At this, the maid requested they at least get a smaller sword, and our hero thought to himself that his little sister Kana was actually starting to grow on him. More time passed, and our main character eventually turned 5 years old. Now, he found himself riding a horse, though unfortunately, it was still just a toy. He was, after all, still a child in this life. His maid approached and asked if he'd like to try riding a real horse. Errol flatly refused, stating that it was far too dangerous. She saw it differently, remarking that all boys are interested in horses and swords, and that it was high time he showed some interest as well. He disliked the notion, retorting that the idea of a prince on a white horse was an outdated relic of the past. Our hero mused that of all the experiences from his past, this reincarnation into the body of a single-digit aged child was the most maddening part. In his previous life, he had reached the pinnacle of fencing, defeating countless powerful opponents, and had also mastered the magical arts, incinerating any obstacle in his path. Every single skill he'd honed to perfection was brought with him into this reborn life. And now, he found he didn't even have much to do. With nothing challenging him, he asked his nanny not to disturb him, claiming he was busy. She agreed, wishing him well with his work. The moment she left, the boy jumped onto his bed and scoffed. What work is there to do? His only plan was to finally get some rest. A short while later, however, the nanny returned to his room, bearing some rather unfortunate news. The boy sat up, asking if what she said was really true. She answered with a solemn nod. Despite his mature mind, tears began to well up in his young eyes, and he desperately told himself to calm down. I managed to hold back tears, slumping into the nearby chair with a defeated sigh. Chaina seemed a bit taken aback, and she wondered aloud if I was truly that opposed to learning. Errol retorted indignantly that he didn't want to, but his nanny gently pointed out that he was now 5 years old. It was high time he started experiencing the world from new perspectives. The boy asked, what if he didn't want to learn? What if he had no interest whatsoever? Chaina remarked that he spoke as if he'd already lived 100 lifetimes, a sentiment that hit a little too close to home for someone who'd been reborn. She found it baffling how he could know so much already. The hero quickly shouted that it wasn't like that at all, while internally thinking about the truth. He'd had his fill of science up to his eyeballs. He was just sick of learning the same things over and over again. It's the tedious curse of reincarnation. The nanny pressed on, explaining that according to imperial law, 5 was the official age to begin one's education. To that end, she presented him with a stack of books. The boy asked with dripping sarcasm, "Oh, but why so few?" He picked one up and announced that he absolutely adored books. For spinning. And he proceeded to do just that. Chaina, not expecting this, insisted that books were meant for reading, not for twirling around. She told him he should be ashamed. He knew full well that countless commoner children dreamed of an education but lacked the opportunity. The majority of them couldn't even read a single word. Therefore, as a prince, he had a duty to respect books. It was time to stop fooling around, and Aurella's only thought at that moment was how to get her to leave as quickly as possible, and once he had a plan, he put it into action. He threw himself on his back and began screaming at the top of his lungs that he didn't want to do a single thing. He wailed about how he wouldn't study and burst into a flood of crocodile tears. Naturally, this dramatic lamentation summoned his mother, and the boy's little performance promptly ended with him on his knees, posing as a diligent student. And just like that, there he was, sitting quietly and reading. He understood perfectly well that he should be learning at this age, but the cruel irony of his situation was that the more capable he appeared, the more he would endanger those around him. After all, as the gifted son of a mere concubine and the emperor, the sooner his rivals would want to get rid of him. It might seem terribly unfair, but fate had already woven this path for his new life, leaving him with no choice but to take matters into his own small hands. Chaina brought him some tea, encouraging him to try harder, saying that then he would also make his mother happy. The prince replied that he was probably too lazy for that, but his caretaker simply pleaded with him to think it over. If he continued to act this way, Lady Lelfin would be terribly upset. Errol knew she was right. He truly didn't want to disappoint his mother, so he reluctantly agreed with his nanny to study hard, though he privately resolved to study everything except for fencing. That way, he was sure to get knocked around a bit, a place he'd like to send a few other people, too. He wondered what he would become without all this political maneuvering. Just like that, a week of lessons flew by. The hero was then horrified to learn that a mage from the tower had come to. The maid explained that this man was here to help him learn magic. His first task would be to determine if he even possessed a talent for it, after which his studies could begin. The boy's mind raced. He absolutely did not want to become a mage. This was a huge problem. If he was a powerful mage, he would undoubtedly sense his own power. There was a vast amount of energy stored within him, accumulated over many years, and he had to find a way to conceal his true abilities. On the way there, the nanny tried to reassure the boy, telling him not to worry and that it would all be over quickly and painlessly. And so, they arrived at the guest room, where the mage was already waiting by the table. He laid his eyes upon the young prince, and the expression on his face. The wizard's shocked expression said it all, though Errol could perceive his own internal energy flows with perfect clarity. He wondered just what the man was seeing, or rather, not seeing, as the wizard approached, examined him, and declared the situation to be simply unbelievable. Shayna marveled aloud, asking if their prince was some kind of special child, to which the wizard noted that special wasn't quite the right word. In fact, it was quite the opposite. Playing his part, the young prince innocently asked what was wrong, and the man reported that he couldn't sense any mana within him whatsoever. The nanny was utterly stunned, while the wizard added that he had even performed a magical probe only to find absolutely nothing. In that moment, Aurel knew his gambit had worked. He had successfully concealed his immense powers. On the way here, he had diligently suppressed his mana circulation, concentrating it all into a single, undetectable point, effectively hiding the vast energy he'd stored since being reborn. When he witnessed the mage's baffled reaction, he breathed an internal sigh of relief. After all, you couldn't see mana if it wasn't there to be seen. And so, the visiting wizard regretfully informed Mrs. Liana that the young prince possessed no aptitude for magic. She couldn't quite grasp what he meant, but our hero knew this diagnosis. Not finding a single speck of mana in his body had its drawbacks. The wizard explained that even a commoner typically has a flicker of mana, yet the prince, a royal, had none of it. Aurel briefly wondered if this was the right path as his mother's face fell with understanding, her voice barely a whisper. So, he can't become a magician? In that instant, he had deeply disappointed his mother, a fact that stung with shame, but this was a necessary part of his plan after his reincarnation. Everyone had to believe he was a weak and incapable toddler. With that, her supposedly incompetent son had just taken the first step in his grand scheme. Soon after, a swordsmanship mentor arrived at his door, proclaiming he would teach the boy all the necessary skills, promising that with hard training, it wouldn't be long before he was as strong as his instructor. Aurel considered this with deep sarcasm, as the mentor was a young man of about 25 years old. At most, Aurel immediately recognized him as a novice, someone as far from a true knight as the earth is from the moon. Aurel's spirit was that of a veteran, forged in countless battles against nightmarish creatures this young man had never even dreamed of. Who was this upstart to teach him? But he couldn't say that aloud, so he simply agreed with Reynold to begin the practice. Let him teach, he thought. The mentor asked for his trust, assuring him he would certainly become stronger, as every young student must always begin with the fundamentals. Aurel then mentioned that he'd recently seen his little sister, Kanye, wear the bands to enhance her physical capabilities. The teacher noted that this was quite normal for the esteemed Canis family. Aurel found the idea a bit intense, so he simply asked what their first lesson would be. Reynold began demonstrating the absolute basics of swordsmanship, namely, flexibility and balance. He assured the prince they would start with the easiest exercises, so there was no need to worry. And so, it wasn't long before Aurel was feigning immense difficulty with the balance training. Sensing the boy's hesitation, the mentor reassured him he wouldn't get hurt by falling from such a low height. Aurel put on a show of indignation, claiming he had a terrible fear of heights he simply couldn't control. The instructor sighed. Does this mean we can't move on to flexibility either? He mused that someone so young should find it very easy, but when it came to the flexibility training, Aurel made it look anything but easy. Frustrated, the instructor suggested they try something else entirely. He had him point the sword, trying to hit the exact center of a target, but unsurprisingly, the precision training was also a complete failure, and Reynold couldn't believe the results. Playing the part of a dejected child, Aurel asked if this meant he was completely talentless, confirming the mentor's worst fears. This was merely his initial practice, so he resolved to continue training, confident it would all pay off. All he needed to do was pick up his sword and persevere. While training, Aurel sensed he was being watched, which was perfect. The more mediocre he appeared, the sooner his observers would back off. And just as he'd planned, rumors of the young prince's mediocrity spread like wildfire. It was whispered behind closed doors that Prince Aurel had no more mana than a commoner. The Empress was also informed that his body was so frail he could barely even stand on his own 2 feet. The reports concluded he had no talent for magic whatsoever. The woman's lips curved into a smile as she claimed this was pleasant news to hear, and our hero knew these rumors were the perfect tool to lower one's guard. He had played this game many times before. After some time, the boy inquired if his new teacher was scheduled to arrive. The maid assured him that he would be there soon. By now, everyone who was anyone was Aurel was a completely useless prince. Almost every tutor had refused to teach him, and yet there was one brave soul who dared to come. Soon, the distinct pounding of hooves echoed from the street. The carriage carrying his new primary teacher had finally arrived. The man introduced himself, stating his name was Hamel Parn. He would be the boy's instructor from this day forward, assigned to teach him foreign languages. Looking at the man's expression, Aurel wondered if he had been forced into this role, for there was a distinct look of utter desperation on his face. Placing a stack of books on the table, the man explained it was a standard manual that would allow him to learn the basics of grammar in just a single day. This, he claimed, was the normal pace of learning. Tomorrow, the plan was to advance the topic. He patronizingly told the prince he would get the hang of it eventually, so he shouldn't let himself worry. Our hero couldn't understand what was wrong with this man. but simply stated that he would try his best. The teacher replied that poor grades were possible, but there was no need to be upset. Studying, he lectured, was primarily a matter of interest, and only then a matter of ability. The boy didn't understand why he was being told all of this. He at least wished the man had asked his opinion on the matter. He hoped he wouldn't just be ignored. Just then, a knight entered and began to yell. Slipping away into the library, he mused that, though his body was small, he was a master of languages, having studied them for a lifetime before being reborn. Errol's linguistic abilities were quite exceptional, a gift from his reincarnation. Soon, he began to put his unique skills to the test. First, he needed to find a dictionary. Using the power he possessed, he effortlessly retrieved books from the highest shelves. In the process, he decided that perhaps more foreign literature should be acquired. In the end, he had collected a great number of books and stacked them all neatly on the parrot table. He quickly realized that while there were many fascinating things in this world, the languages were all composed along similar lines, so it was only a matter of time before he completely surpassed his own teacher. Time passed, and the hour for his lesson arrived. The teacher told the boy that he was making a terrible joke. It was beyond his comprehension how he could have possibly learned all the point-to-point material. Our hero pointed out that he wasn't lying at all. It was the absolute truth. He then asked if he should begin his demonstration. The tutor, still skeptical, wondered if he had truly memorized everything, so he decided to test him. Errol declared that there was no reason for him to lie, thinking to himself that, compared to the languages from neighboring countries, the native imperial language was still a bit of a challenge. Not trusting the young gentleman, Hamill demanded he read from a specific book. The hero knew that no matter how intelligent a child is, reading even one simple book before the age of 13 is a struggle, and yet here was a 5-year-old child claiming to have learned multiple languages in just 2 days. The boy enthusiastically began to read the foreign book with perfect pronunciation, which left his teacher utterly astounded. The teacher was absolutely thrilled with his new conversational partner, exclaiming how wonderful it was, knowing that a student's success directly elevates a mentor's standing. Errol felt a surge of pride, enjoying the admiration. As their lessons resumed, the young prince selected a subject he knew he could effortlessly master. Meanwhile, in the upper echelons of society, whispers circulated about Prince Errol's complete inability to even properly wield a sword. It seemed baffling how someone so physically inept could master entire languages in a mere 2 days. People began to wonder if perhaps his talents extended to the precise sciences as well. Rumors of the prince being a little prodigy spread like wildfire, and the primary source of these tales was none other than his own teacher. He boasted that he saw immense potential in the boy, claiming every child possesses a hidden talent. The teacher insisted he was simply guiding the prince to unveil this gift in all its glory. Of course, the boy's dear tutor was patting himself on the back after this minor success. Eventually, these whispers of genius reached the ears of the emperor himself, who began to take notice. It seemed the prince was a genius after all. Evidently, swordsmanship and magic simply weren't his forte, and he couldn't be forced into something he disliked. Liana expressed her sincere regret for having upset the emperor, while privately thinking how much her son had changed recently. It was as if he'd been reborn into a different person. This sudden shift made her question if she was even raising him correctly. Noticing her troubled expression, Theo gently asked if she was feeling worried. He reassured her, saying he believed their son was growing into a wonderful young man. As usual, Errol was listening in, thinking to himself that he had many more wonders to reveal, but it was best to unveil them gradually to keep everyone intrigued. In the meantime, he could just sit back and enjoy the rewards of his new reputation as a genius. A few days passed, and the royal knights were lined up in perfect formation, awaiting their commander's orders. The young prince watched them with feigned admiration, remarking on the large number of knights that had been assigned to him. He surmised the emperor must have deemed it necessary to provide extra protection for a prince who couldn't defend himself. What a caring father, he thought with a hint of irony. Suddenly, a sharp knock on his door made the boy jump. Startled, he called out to see who it was. It turned out to be a group of maids, hauling in a rather large chest. Errol immediately asked what was inside. Just then, his mother, Liana, entered the room, announcing that they were gifts from His Majesty the Emperor. The prince feigned surprise that the emperor would send a gift for him. Liana simply told him not to ask too many questions and proceeded to open the chest for him to see. The contents truly amazed him. It was filled with shimmering gold coins and an assortment of dazzling jewels. What a lavish gift! Our hero was genuinely delighted. His eyes, however, were drawn to one particular pendant, and he immediately asked what it was. A maid, however, simply asking him how he liked the emperor's precious gifts. But the prince was persistent, repeating his question about the specific type of pendant it was. The answer he received was that it was an artifact designed to aid concentration and activate one's mental faculties, but it had a side effect of making one's brain feel like it was boiling, leading to extreme fatigue. The maid added that for the prince to notice it was truly awesome. Errol realized then that a normal person would only see a beautiful pendant, but thanks to his reincarnation, he could perceive the potent mana swirling within the stone. He knew he had no personal use for it though. Perhaps I should give it to my little sister, he mused. She has been training so hard lately. She's practically turning into an orangutan. He then declared his intention to give the pendant to his little sister, Kana. His mother quickly pointed out that it was a gift from His Majesty, but she supposed the emperor wouldn't mind if he gifted just one item to his sister. With that settled, they moved on to admiring the other jewel, and it turned into a joyous day for everyone in their wing of the castle. all thanks to the emperor's lavish and generous gift. The prince, who also served as the captain of the knights, delivered a stern admonition for everyone to understand their assigned duty. Their sacred mission was to protect the concubine's castle and to carry that pride in their hearts. Meanwhile, Errol was seated at the dining table when his nanny announced the arrival of dessert, proudly presenting the chef's most exquisite pastries. Intrigued, the young boy decided to sample one, only to realize with immediate disappointment that it was nothing like he expected. The woman encouraged him to eat more slowly, asking if it was truly that delicious. But his reaction was the complete opposite. He exclaimed that they weren't tasty at all, as they were. The girl was taken aback, since the cook had sworn everything would be perfect, and she offered to summon him. But that's when Errol corrected her, demanding she call for the alchemist instead. He was thinking about how desperately he wanted a Coca-Cola, so he would need an alchemist's skill to recreate its signature fizz and bite. The maid questioned his request, but why an alchemist, specifically? And the boy immediately thought to himself that she wouldn't possibly understand even if he tried to explain it to her. It was undeniably strange for a 5-year-old child to demand an alchemist, but creating the flavors he liked without an alchemist's help was simply unrealistic. He had no idea how food was processed to get the flavor of something like cola. Such technology didn't exist in this world, and his craving for a cold, carbonated Coca-Cola was overwhelming, but it was unclear how to get one. He then decided it wasn't worth using Brian's fascination. After all, as a genius, he would surely figure something out. With that resolve, he bolted from the table, and when asked where he was going, he simply declared, to study. Chana could hardly believe what she heard, wondering if she'd misheard him, as the boy sprinted through the halls, convinced that cooking was just another form of chemistry. In that case, an alchemist was exactly what he needed, and it was a path worth trying. 3 years flew by since then, and Errol was now a sharp 8-year-old. He found himself in a high-level meeting where an old man reported that the country was planning to construct several new bridges, primarily in regions with heavy merchant activity. Concluding his report, he turned to the prince and asked for his opinion on the matter. The young boy, deeply focused, remarked that it was a rather interesting concept before pointedly inquiring as to who was the architect of this bridge design. The table swelled with pride, informing the prince that it was his own work, a project he had toiled on day and night. But then, Errol delivered a stunning blow, warning the man that if he ever brought forward something so flawed again, he would be dismissed immediately. He explained that while it looked aesthetically pleasing, the moment snow accumulated in winter, the entire structure would collapse to hell. The design was far too congested and posed a serious safety risk for any citizens who would choose to use such a structure. They had clearly invested everything into scenery and grandeur with absolutely zero consideration for practical function. There was still a tremendous amount of work to be done. The flustered designer quickly promised that he would rectify the flaws immediately. It became clear that because of his extensive knowledge, our protagonist from the highest roof was being buried under a mountain of work. He was merely advising the minister, drawing upon the advanced technological knowledge he retained from his *** reincarnation ***. An 8-year-old child counseling seasoned officials was absolute nonsense, but it was unclear what other choice they had. Now was his time to truly demonstrate his abilities. After the meeting, our hero stepped outside, only to be spotted by a maid who whispered in awe about the silver-haired sage. Hearing this ridiculous nickname, the hero was utterly baffled, not understanding why it was so incredibly foolish. She quickly realized he'd overheard her and offered a hasty apology, prompting him to ask where that stupid nickname even came from. He requested that she refrain from calling him that name from now on, and she assured him she would keep it in mind. It turned out that people had concocted a rather silly nickname for one he found utterly lame. Following this, he proceeded to the carriage, which departed shortly after. Liana witnessed the entire scene from her window and inquired with her maid about where Errol was headed. The young woman informed her that he had requested a formal audience with His Majesty. This news completely stunned the boy's mother, who wondered what his intentions could possibly be. The maid explained that the young prince went to the emperor to request permission to study alchemy. His father's reaction was incredible, but the fact that he accepted so quickly meant Errol had earned his special favor, which wasn't surprising given how hard he works for the good of the entire empire. Of course, even with the wisdom gained from his reincarnation, he was still nervous during their conversation. He understood that he had to be as articulate as possible while remaining respectful and unobtrusive. As their talk continued, the emperor asked why he wished to study alchemy. Errol replied that he felt it was his duty to benefit the empire, and he saw a great opportunity to do so within the field of alchemy, especially since he wasn't gifted in swordsmanship or the magical arts. All that was left for him was science. His father hadn't expected to hear such words, thinking to himself that the boy was remarkably sensible with a good head on his shoulders. Consequently, he agreed to provide him with an alchemy tutor, asking if that was the full extent of his request. Errol confirmed that was all he needed. They then shared a smile, and he felt a sense of accomplishment, believing he had handled the situation perfectly. After the official announcement that Prince Errol required an alchemy teacher, a long line of candidates quickly assembled. It was an opportunity for them to etch their names into the annals of history. A test was devised to create a mirror that could reflect sunlight all the way to the horizon. Before long, a man emerged who had completed the task flawlessly, a true master of alchemy. The name of this fortunate individual was Darren Langet. He arrived at the young master's residence, complimenting its beauty. When Aurella saw him, he was surprised, as he had expected an old man, and he found himself wondering if his tutor's stark white hair was natural. The alchemist was slightly taken aback by the personal question but explained that it was not his natural hair color. It was the result of having conducted countless chemical experiments and inhaling all sorts of noxious fumes, which had caused his hair to turn white. The hero understood immediately, but he couldn't help but wonder how the man had managed to survive after being exposed to such dangerous substances for so long. Outwardly, Darren was quite calm, but Aurella suspected it was a mask, for alchemy is a ruthless pursuit. If one gets injured or even dies during research, there is no one else to blame. Darren then ventured to warn the prince that the study of alchemy is a rather hazardous endeavor, a science where the tuition can be extremely costly. Our hero noted that he had already weighed all the risks. His reborn mind understood that alchemy is a science, not magic. He had no foolish expectations of learning to turn lead into gold. He simply wanted to explore practical applications, like discovering the strongest metal alloys or creating a new material that would make building houses much easier. The teacher was astounded by this pragmatic approach, realizing the rumors about the prince were true. He was indeed different from everyone else. This was the man who would one day lead their empire. Eagerly, he offered to explore these ideas together. He promised to teach him everything he knew, and so, a few days after their meeting, Aurella officially began his studies in alchemy. The instructor asked His Highness if he had by any chance studied alchemy on his own before. The boy grew wary, thinking, is my knowledge from my past life really that obvious? To deflect any suspicion, Errol casually remarked that he had merely skimmed a couple of books, leading Darren to conclude that the rumors about the prince's genius were indeed true. A wave of relief washed over Errol. It appeared his mentor suspected nothing of his true origins. Their lessons began at the crack of dawn and stretched on until the sun had already dipped below the horizon. The young prince then suggested that his tutor might consider using shells or bones to fortify the iron alloy, making it stronger. His tutor confirmed that Errol had grasped the concept perfectly. The prince now also understood how to extract lead and various other chemicals. Aside from the unique metals and medicines of this world, everything else was identical to the knowledge he carried from before his reincarnation. So, he casually blurted out that there wasn't much of a difference. Darren shot him a surprised look, but the prince immediately claimed he was merely thinking aloud. He inwardly smiled, realizing his grand plan, conceived shortly after being reborn, was proceeding flawlessly. Before long, word reached the emperor that a formal petition had arrived from Prince Errol. It stated his desire to expand the alchemist staff to a team of 4. In response, the emperor commanded that the finest alchemists in the entire empire be assembled. His subordinates, however, were filled with apprehension. They questioned what the prince intended to do with these alchemists, fearing that if they began draining the empire's budget on research, the populace might become outraged. The emperor, Thiel, instantly recalled the private audience where he had discussed this very matter with his son. Consequently, he firmly declared that the prince was practicing alchemy for the ultimate good of the empire. Upon their arrival, Errol informed the assembled alchemists of his intention to create something entirely new, a beverage. One of the men, his expression clearly wary, inquired as to what precisely the prince meant. Wondering aloud if this was some sort of culinary invention, Errol noted with a satisfied smirk that he had been understood perfectly. He had already devised a brilliant plan to popularize the final product. It seemed that by leveraging this unique approach, a great deal could be accomplished. Yet, before he could elaborate further, the hopeful expressions on the faces of the alchemists noticeably soured. Some of the new arrivals began to quietly lament that despite the prince's famed intelligence and talent, all this effort was for the creation of a mere drink. A few even felt a pang of regret for abandoning their previous posts for such a questionable project. To dispel their growing doubts, the young prince casually tossed a handful of gold coins onto the table, immediately capturing their attention. With this gesture, he hastened to assure them that there was absolutely no reason for concern. The financial reward, he promised, would exceed their wildest expectations. The actual success was set. Any result they produced would be handsomely compensated, regardless of the final outcome. The same man who had asked the question earlier could only sigh and nod, as if resigning himself to the inevitable. Another alchemist then remarked that the prince's objective was becoming clearer. It seemed the prince was eager to create a special kind of sparkling water, even though similar concoctions already existed. It was obvious this time it was about something truly novel, a concept he essentially brought with him through his reincarnation. At that, the prince hoped for only one thing, that every single one of them would give it their all. After all, the promise of immense wealth and fame was a powerful motivator, which meant the work would surely proceed at a much faster pace. A few days later, several shipments of mineral water were delivered from abroad. The young prince reported that they now possessed the base samples they required. Darren eyed the strange liquid with considerable disbelief, wondering if it was even possible. On the surface, it didn't appear to be of any particular interest. The prince, however, after carefully studying the water, suggested that it was unlikely to match his intended final product in its current state, but that it was merely a matter of time. Shortly after, a rather unpleasant odor began to waft through, leaving them utterly bewildered by the strange, awful substance. In a rush, he moved on to inspect the other barrels, but the results were equally disappointing. He then declared that natural mineral water wasn't viable and proposed a new path, creating artificial water. His audience, almost in unison, immediately questioned how exactly they were supposed to accomplish such a feat. The young prince, drawing on knowledge from a life he'd lived before his reincarnation, revealed he had already prepared a theoretical framework and asked them to evaluate and perfect it, stating he'd await their reports at the next meeting. Aurel held a firm belief that his alchemists were the most brilliant minds available. Seeking confirmation, he glanced at his mentor, who confidently affirmed that these men were truly the finest alchemists in the entire Empire of Arnesia. The boy remarked with a knowing smile that it was time to put his theory to the ultimate test. After all, what could be more thrilling for an alchemist? As he departed, he briefly wondered if 1 week would truly be sufficient. He could only hope the motivation he'd ignited would fuel their success. Precisely 1 week later, Aurel addressed the esteemed alchemists, fervently proclaiming that their discovery would revolutionize the entire Empire of Arnesia. He urged them to welcome the next great trend of the era, carbonated water, which he dramatically described as the very fuel of progress itself. In his heart, he harbored doubts about creating even a distant replica of the drinks he remembered, but to his astonishment, they had made it a reality, and he couldn't resist the urge to taste the final product. His mentor cautiously inquired if he was certain it was safe to consume. The other alchemists also hesitated, clearly not eager to take the first sip, but the prince effortlessly brushed aside their concerns, encouraging them to simply give it a try. All that was left was to mix the sparkling water with fruit juice or alcohol to create a proper beverage. Of course, a part of him still longed for the classic taste of cola from his past, but he knew that was an impossible goal at this stage. These were merely the first prototypes. It remained to be seen just how successful they were. Wasting no time, he decided to begin with lemon juice. After meticulously mixing the necessary ingredients, he took a taste, and a moment later, a brilliant smile spread across his face. It was genuinely delicious. Encouraged by the success, he immediately urged everyone else to sample the drink with him, wanting them to appreciate the unique flavor they had created. The alchemists were still hesitant, but it wasn't long before they were all raving about the extraordinary taste. The new concoction was aptly named Prince Errol's Lemonade. This revolutionary drink quickly soared in popularity, its fame spreading far beyond the empire's borders. It achieved the status of an expensive delicacy, becoming a must-have luxury for the entire nobility. Inevitably, it was soon sampled by the count as well, who wondered aloud if the young prince was truly behind its creation. This was Count Dement, the powerful lord of the northern territories of the empire. A servant confirmed that it was indeed true, adding that the creation process was said to have been personally overseen by Prince Errol himself. The drink's immense popularity had turned it into a luxury item, making a significant contribution to the empire's economy. Rumors even claimed that wagons filled with gold were constantly arriving at the concubine's castle. The count then realized his grave mistake. He had dismissed the prince as just another child, a boy who now seemed almost reborn with wisdom. If only he had known, he would have acted immediately. Now, all he could do was wallow in regret. Meanwhile, Kane continued her rigorous swordsmanship training. By this time, she had already reached the age of 16. After a flawless demonstration of her skills, she eagerly asked Errol for his opinion, and he responded with clear admiration. "That was incredible. She's every bit as cool as they say." Her servant's words rang true. The girl was a genuinely professional swordswoman. Errol had to agree. She was more skilled than most men her age, and to top it all off, she was undeniably cute. The young lady beamed at the praise, while her attendant suggested she should take a break. Kanya then turned to the prince, mentioning that she had been hearing quite a lot about him recently. His famous miracle water had gained popularity not just within the empire, but far beyond its borders, which was an amazing feat. Errol puffed his chest out proudly, admitting he was the mastermind behind it all. Kanya acknowledged that the rumors were indeed true. He was the very picture of the emperor's perfect son, completely unaware of how much people envied Lady Lana. After all, Errol had dedicated the development of his soda water to his mother, Lafan Anist. The Aris family had once been a noble house, but they had fallen on hard times and become impoverished. They were left with nothing but a title and a small estate, barely scraping by. Upon learning of his mother's family's unfortunate fate, our protagonist decided to act. He allocated them a share in his burgeoning soda business, a move that paid off spectacularly, because the demand for his soda was absolutely overwhelming. Following that success, the young prince introduced yogurt and even monosodium glutamate, both of which quickly became massive commercial hits. The Henri's family's finances skyrocketed, and now, no other company could even hope to compare with their wealth. And just like that, the family was surrounded by luxury. Kanya then remarked that he truly was on top of his game. Errol cheekily asked if she was jealous, offering to treat her to lemonade, waffles, and syrup. But his teasing was cut short when a sword was suddenly pointed at him, startling him. Kanya called him a bragger, reminding him that she had plenty of her own money. He, on the other hand, had never even learned to properly hold a blade, and for that very reason, she declared she was going to teach him. Our hero thought he didn't really need the training, given his past life's experiences, but he couldn't refuse her offer, claiming he'd be delighted to learn from such a master. It was a strange feeling, being taught something he felt he'd already witnessed before his reincarnation, As their training began, he mused that the phrase, "saw it in my coffin," felt oddly literal for him. The princess demonstrated a simple combination, instructing him to observe her movements carefully. Errol decided to play along, performing the move without much enthusiasm in the hopes she would quickly lose interest. He had to admire her, though. She was striving so hard for her dream,